There is a night every empath eventually reaches, and it never announces itself in advance. No breakdown, no scene, no tears at 3 a.m., just a quiet click somewhere behind the ribs, and then, nothing where there used to be everything. Carl Jung spent decades studying people who arrived at this exact point, and what he documented unsettled even him. This wasn't burnout. It wasn't depression. It wasn't the empath giving up at all. It was the final stage of awakening. And here is the part almost no one is prepared for. When an empath stops caring the way they used to, they don't shrink. They don't harden into someone smaller. They become someone the old world can no longer reach. Not cruel, not cold, ungovernable. Jung called the mechanism individuation, not becoming a better version of who everyone needed them to be, but becoming, for the first time, only themselves. This isn't the story of an empath losing their gift. What follows is the story of an empath finally discovering who it was always supposed to belong to. Before we can understand why an empath ever stops, we have to see what it costs them to start. Jung noticed a pattern in his most sensitive patients that had nothing to do with weakness. These were not people who simply felt things a little more than everyone else. Their nervous systems worked less like a person and more like an antenna, permanently tuned to every frequency in the room. They walked into a house and could tell within seconds who wasn't speaking to whom. They sat at a dinner table and instinctively took on the job no one had ever formally assigned them, keeping the silence from turning into something worse. They weren't just present in a relationship, they were its thermostat, quietly regulating a temperature everyone else got to set, and nobody else even noticed needed regulating. Jung had a name for what people like this became inside their own families and friendships, the unpaid translator. Fluent in everyone else's unspoken grief, everyone else's disguised anger, everyone else's fear, dressed up as control. But no one in their life had ever bothered to learn their language in return. And the cruelest part is that no one forced this role onto them. They were praised into it. Every time they swallowed their own need to smooth someone else's mood, they were called mature. Every time they absorbed a parent's anxiety so the house could stay calm, they were called strong. Every time they gave up their turn to speak so someone else could be heard, they were called kind, generous, easy to love. Not one of those words was technically a lie. That's exactly what made the trap so effective. Because underneath the compliments, a pattern was silently forming that Jung considered one of the more dangerous a person can develop: self-abandonment, wearing the costume of virtue. The empath began to measure their worth like a service fee, something they paid over and over, just to remain welcome in rooms that were never actually built to hold the whole of them. But here is what Jung found most fascinating and most quietly tragic. While the empath kept performing warmth on the surface, something underneath them was taking meticulous notes. Not their conscious mind. Their conscious mind was too busy managing everyone else's crisis to notice its own. This was happening lower, in the part of the psyche Jung believed never forgets a single betrayal, even the small ones, even the ones the empath insisted, out loud, on excusing. Ask any empath who has spent a decade holding a family together, and they can tell you, without hesitating, exactly which sentence will make their mother cry on command, exactly which tone means their partner is about to lie to their face, exactly how long a friend will let them vent before smoothly steering the subject back to themselves. They had memorized everyone's patterns with the precision of someone studying for a test they never agreed to take. And despite knowing all of it, They never once used it against anyone. They just kept translating, kept absorbing, kept showing up, until the ledger their unconscious had been keeping in silence finally came due. It's never a small disappointment that ends this chapter. Jung was specific about that. It's always betrayal, and it's always betrayal from someone the empath spent years defending, excusing, and quietly carrying. The pattern repeats with almost mathematical consistency. A partner they made excuses for in front of their own friends turns out to have been lying the entire time. A parent they defended at every family gathering is overheard describing them, behind their back, as too much, too sensitive, too needy. A friend they dropped everything for, more than once, can't be bothered to check in during the worst month of their life. What breaks the empath is rarely the betrayal itself. It's the moment they realize they saw it coming and chose not to look. Their body had been warning them for months. A tightness before certain phone calls, a hesitation before certain names, a quiet, persistent voice they had trained themselves to override because believing the best in people had always felt safer than trusting their own instincts. So the anger, when it finally surfaces, doesn't only point outward. It turns inward first, toward every boundary they didn't set, toward every red flag they translated into a reasonable explanation, toward every version of themselves that stayed 20 minutes, 20 days, or 20 years too long. This is the moment Jung called the collapse of the projection. Not the collapse of the relationship, the collapse of who the empath had convinced themselves that person could still become. They weren't grieving a person, they were grieving a fantasy they had been personally financing for years. And when a fantasy that size collapses, it rarely announces itself with tears. It arrives as silence. Here's what almost no one expects. The empath doesn't rage. They don't collapse into the version of themselves everyone has already seen 100 times. The one who cries, then forgives, then quietly resets the whole cycle. This time, unlike every time before it, something different happens. They go quiet. Not sad quiet, clear quiet. Their eyes stop searching for an explanation because this time they don't need one. The fog they had been calling love, or loyalty, or patience, simply lifts, and underneath it is a version of reality they had spent years avoiding. If you felt that tightness in your chest just now, you probably already know exactly what this feels like. Before you keep watching, drop 2 words in the comments below. I'm awake. You'll understand exactly why by the end of this video. Jung described witnessing this particular shift in a patient as one of the more unsettling moments of his entire career. Not because the person seemed broken, because they finally seemed free. What happens next is the part Jung spent the rest of his career trying to explain to people who had never lived through it themselves. Every empath carries a half of themselves they were taught to be ashamed of, the part that wants things for no one but themselves, that gets tired of being needed, that would rather protect their own peace than rescue someone else's chaos. Most were taught this half was selfish, something to bury, apologize for, override on command. Jung disagreed completely. He believed this wasn't the selfish half at all. It was the survival half, the part of the psyche built specifically to stop a person from being slowly consumed by everyone else's unmet needs. When betrayal finally forces that buried half into the light, the empath doesn't become someone worse. They become someone whole for the first time in their life. Not the loving half winning, not the guarded half winning, both, finally, sitting in the same room. An empath like this still feels everything. They still notice tension in a room before anyone speaks. They still sense a lie forming before it's finished being told. The difference is what happens after. They no longer feel obligated to fix what they notice. They no longer owe an explanation for the compassion they choose not to extend. This is what individuation actually looks like in a real person. Not becoming detached from the world, but finally becoming the one who decides how much of themselves the world gets to have. They stopped being available. They started being intentional. Not the same person with lower standards. A different person entirely, built from the same heart, with a door installed for the first time. The shift shows up first at home, because home is usually where the pattern started. Always the one who hosted every holiday, always the first to call after an argument, always the one absorbing tension so no one else had to. This is the empath who simply stops volunteering for a role no one ever formally offered them, and no one ever thanked them for either. They still show up, they just stop performing. Parents who built an entire relationship on the empath's guilt suddenly find guilt doesn't land the way it used to. A sibling who always needed a mediator discovers there isn't one left standing in the room. The family, confused and sometimes furious, starts asking the same question. What happened to you? You used to be so understanding. And the empath, this time, doesn't apologize for the answer. Not distant, not cold, done performing. Friendships shift too, just as quietly, without a single dramatic conversation. One friend who was always available at midnight, always first to show up with food after a breakup, always remembered every detail of everyone else's life while rarely mentioning their own, starts letting some messages sit until morning. Not out of spite, out of noticing the friendship had only ever run in one direction. Some friends notice and adjust, a little embarrassed it took this long. Others drift away, having only ever loved the convenience of them. Either way, the empath doesn't chase the ones who leave. No abandonment, addition by subtraction. At work, the shift looks almost administrative, which is exactly why it unsettles people so much. The colleague who used to absorb everyone's stress, stay late fixing problems that weren't theirs, and manage the emotional temperature of an entire department, starts doing something radical. Their actual job, during their actual hours, and nothing else. Managers who quietly built a whole workflow around this person's overfunctioning suddenly have to manage their own team again. Co-workers who treated them as a free therapist get redirected, politely, to HR, to their own manager, to anyone but them. Nothing about their competence changes. What changes is that they stop being free labor for other people's emotional gaps. Still excellent, just paid now only for the job they actually signed up for. But nowhere is the shift more visible than in love. One partner who once explained away every red flag, forgave every broken promise twice, and mistook exhaustion for depth, stops accepting behavior they used to defend to their own friends. Some partners rise to meet this. They recognize exactly what they've been allowed to get away with, and they choose to become someone worth the forgiveness instead of relying on it. Those relationships rarely end. They finally begin, on equal footing, for the first time. Others can't adjust. They miss the version of the empath who excused everything, absorbed everything, asked for nothing in return. When the old tactics stop working on them, they usually leave to look for someone new to carry what this one no longer will. That version of the empath doesn't chase them either. Not heartbreak, not victory, just quiet, finally, where there used to be noise. Here is the part of Jung's research that made even him uneasy. These awakened empaths didn't just protect their peace, they became almost impossible to deceive. They could spot a narcissist within the first 10 minutes of a conversation, often before that person had said anything overtly wrong, just from the shape of the compliments, the speed of the charm, the total absence of curiosity about anyone but themselves. They recognized love bombing as a pattern instead of a compliment. They clocked a manipulative silence for exactly what it was, instead of quietly mistaking it, once again, for their own fault. Years of involuntary emotional fluency had turned into something closer to an instrument, one that almost nobody could play anymore, without the empath noticing exactly which string was being pulled and why. And this is the part that should terrify anyone who ever took advantage of them, but rarely does, because the empath never uses it that way. They know exactly which sentence would humiliate the people who hurt them. They remember every secret ever handed to them in trust. They could, if they wanted to, dismantle the version of themselves other people carefully built to justify their own behavior. Yet they don't. Not because they're weak, not because they're still afraid, because revenge would put them right back in the exact role they just spent years escaping. Someone whose entire worth is measured by what they do for, or to, other people. Jung called this restraint the truest sign of integration. Not the absence of power, the refusal to abuse it. People who once relied on this empath's silence to feel safe suddenly find that same silence a little unnerving. Not because it's hostile, because it's finally unreadable. Something else happens here too, something Jung apparently didn't expect. People who are only ever comfortable around performance start to feel strangely exposed around this version of the empath, even when nothing is said. Manipulators sense, almost immediately, that the usual script won't work here anymore, and quietly go looking for someone easier to read. Meanwhile, the people capable of real reciprocity, the rare ones who were never trying to extract anything in the first place, finally feel safe enough to get close. The empath doesn't have to screen anyone anymore. Their presence does it without effort. Not a wall, a filter. With that shift, the empath doesn't just change how they respond to people, they change who gets access to them at all. They start choosing work that respects their sensitivity instead of quietly mining it for free. Some become the kind of therapist, teacher, or creator who can hold someone else's pain without drowning in it. Others simply choose smaller, quieter lives on purpose, ones with enough room left over to hear themselves think. Their friendships stop being rescue missions. Every relationship becomes something they opted into, instead of something they were assigned by default because they were too kind to ever say no. Home stops being a waiting room for other people's crises and starts being what it was always supposed to be, theirs, fully, without an open-door policy for anyone who knows how to knock. Time stops being infinitely available, and their attention stops being the one thing everyone assumes they can still have for free. None of this makes them harder to love. It makes them, at last, actually possible to know, because what they give now is chosen, not extracted. They finally understand something Jung tried to teach for decades, that almost no one believed until they lived it themselves. You cannot keep pouring from a cup. Nobody around you is willing to help refill. This isn't the empath becoming less generous. It's the empath finally being generous toward the one person who was never on the list. So no, the empath who stops caring hasn't lost their gift. They've simply stopped handing it to anyone who asks. They haven't gone cold. They've gone clear. They haven't stopped loving people. They've stopped loving people more than they love their own peace. They haven't closed themselves off from the world. They've installed a door where there used to be an open field, and they alone decide who gets a key. This is what Jung meant by the final stage of awakening. Not transcendence, not perfection, just a person who spent years being everyone's emotional inheritance, finally choosing to inherit themselves. Not silence, signal, no distance, discernment, not an ending, the first honest beginning they've ever had. If you made it this far, some part of you probably already recognizes this. Maybe you're the one who's always been the strong one, the calm one, the one everyone calls when it's their turn to fall apart. Maybe you're only now starting to notice your own ledger, the one you've never shown anyone either. No one ever required you to stay open to everyone who knocked. The only requirement was surviving long enough to find that out. So if tonight is the night something in you finally goes quiet, let it. That silence isn't the end of who you were. It's the first sentence of who you're about to become. Welcome to the part of the story where you stop performing your own life and finally start living it. You didn't lose your heart in any of this. You just finally learned where to keep it.